Welcome back, students. We are now going to discuss our part 2 of our lecture series, that is, effects of globalization on environment. Let us quickly recollect what we have done in our previous lecture. We have learned about the interlinkages between the environment and the economy. We have learned about the different functions of the environment, where it acts as a resource supplier, it acts as a waste sink, and it acts as a supplier of aesthetic values and spiritual comfort. We have also learned that environment is treated as an externality, and we have learned how to determine the optimal level of this externality. Third, we have learned about the different forms of government intervention required to arrive at this given level of externality. We have learned about permit system, we have learned about the standard setting, and we have learned about the taxes. We have also learned how to determine the optimal level of taxation such that this optimal level of externality is achieved. Now, we shall continue with our lecture. Our lecture this time is based on effects of globalization on environment. As we know, students, the world today has been increasingly linked to each other. Countries are no longer aloof from each other. They are linked to each other through trade, through information flows, through FDI. Now, how all these things impact the environment will be the matter of discussion for us in this lecture series. So, the learning outcomes from this course will be, number 1, impact of free trade on the environment. Number 2, the Environmental Kuznets Curve. Students, you have probably heard about the Kuznets Curve earlier, where the Kuznets Curve showed a relationship between development and inequality. But here, we will be talking about the Environmental Kuznets Curve, that is, the relation between environmental degradation along with increase in per capita income. And in the last section, we will know about the global environmental problems, and we will speak of policy recommendations about how to control them. There have been different types of treaties and protocols to curb environmental pollution. We will be discussing about them and concluding with certain policy recommendations so that how can we control the global levels of pollution. Let us start today with international trade and environment. One of the main aspects of globalization has been international trade. Countries trade with each other in terms of goods and services. Now, how does this free trade affect the environment? Does it affect the environment in a positive way or a negative way? To understand that, I shall be introducing 3 new concepts: the scale effect, the composition effect, and last but not the least, the technology effect. Let us start with the scale effect. As countries trade with each other, the volume of goods and services produced increase. That is, in other words, more output is produced. Now, to make more goods and services, or rather, to produce more output, we need more inputs. Now, we have learnt in our previous section that for production purposes, we extract the resources from the environment. That was the main function of the environment that we had learned as a supplier of inputs. So, to produce more goods and services, more resources are extracted from the environment. Now, as more resources are extracted, more wastes are also generated. So, as the volume of trade goes up, so does the volume of export and import. More wastes and more emissions are generated. So, this tends to degrade the environment. So, because of scale effect, environmental pollution increases. This is the first effect known as scale effect, which arises out of free trade. Next, we come to the composition effect. As the name suggests, free trade results in a change in the structure of the economy. Production changes towards service goods, or production may also move from rural to urban areas. So, as the structure of the economy changes, different types, we can say that for the developed countries, more stress is given on cleaner activities, or developed countries tend to produce goods which are cleaner and which produce less pollution. The composition effect can be divided into two parts or two hypotheses. Number one is the displacement effect and number two is the pollution haven hypothesis. Let us discuss these terms separately. Displacement hypothesis says that when free trade takes place between developed and developing countries, the pollution-intensive industries tend to actually move or migrate to the developing countries. This is because the developed countries, when the pollution standards are much higher, the multinational firms try to avoid those, because in those countries they may require firms to go for certain abatement measures, pollution abatement measures. For example, firms may be asked to install chimneys so that air pollution is reduced. Firms may be asked to go to set up treatment plants so that they do not dump their waste directly into the rivers or to the streams and pollute the water bodies. But all these require a certain amount of cost. That is, the profits of the firms may be reduced that way. So firms, multinational companies, they tend to move away from those countries where the pollution standards are much higher, and they tend to go to those countries where the standards, the environmental regulations are less rigid. So there is a displacement of these firms, these multinational companies, from the developed countries to the developing countries. This is known as displacement hypothesis. It is also known as flight of capital hypothesis, implicating that there is a flight of capital from those countries where environmental standards are more rigid to countries or regions where environmental regulations are not that rigid. The implication of this is that the poor countries become concentrated in dirty or material intensive production, while the richer countries tend to specialize in clean and service intensive production. This also alters their consumption pattern. So, the composition hypothesis says that as far as the developing countries are concerned, they do not tend to gain much out of this composition effect. Rather, they tend to cluster around production of dirty goods. Now let us move on to the other hypothesis known as the pollution heaven hypothesis. As the name suggests, because of the displacement effect, because of the lower trade barriers, the polluting countries, the polluting firms, they move towards the developing countries where the environmental regimens are less rigid. And what does this lead to? The developing countries soon become a haven for pollution. So, this becomes known as pollution haven hypothesis. So, the pollution haven hypothesis basically says that because of lower environmental standards, because of less rigidity in maintaining environmental regulations, firms, multinational companies from developed countries tend to migrate to the developing countries, and as such, the developing countries tend to export those goods, that is, which are more dirty in nature, which we can claim to be the dirty goods. This is what the pollution haven hypothesis is all about. So naturally, for the developing countries, the composition effect leads to greater amount of pollution, whereas for the developed countries, the composite effect leads to reduction in pollution. Next, we come to the technology effect. As a country progresses, especially developed countries, they tend to invest more on research and development. As they tend to progress more with research and development, their technologies get upgraded. Old technologies which required more extraction of materials or energy, they are removed with cleaner technology. As a result of all this, pollution reduces for this type of countries. Now we have to remember the poor countries or the developing countries which are short of finance, they automatically have less resources to spend on research and development. So for these countries, the technology effect is quite low compared to the scale effect. So ultimately, what do we have among all this analysis? For the developing countries, the scale effect outweighs the technology effect. And if you remember, as we said, the scale effect leads to greater amount of pollution. So for developing countries, free trade often results in more pollution. So what we have learned from all this analysis so far? We have learnt about the scale effect, we have learnt about the technology effect, we have learnt about the composition effect. So students, what do we mean by the pollution heaven hypothesis and the displacement hypothesis? The displacement hypothesis states that when developed countries set up a higher environmental standard, firms or multinational firms, they tend to migrate from the developed countries to the less developed countries where the regime is less strict. That is, they get displaced from the developed countries. This is known as displacement hypothesis. And what is pollution heaven hypothesis? The pollution heaven hypothesis states that when the multinational firms migrate to the developing countries, the developing countries tend to produce more of these dirty goods. They start to specialize in these dirty goods where they have a comparative advantage because they can produce these goods at a cheaper rate. So ultimately, the less developed countries become a haven for pollution. Next, we will move towards the Environmental Kuznets Curve. As I said that you have probably learnt about the Kuznets curve earlier in your theory. The Kuznets curve, earlier what we have learnt, depicts the relationship between inequality and development. What type of relationship did it talk about? Now, as a country progresses, initially inequality rises. Slowly it reaches a peak, after which inequality starts to fall. That is, we carve out an inverted U-shaped curve. Similarly, the Environmental Kuznets curve is also an inverted U-shaped curve. Let me show you the diagram. This is the shape of the Environmental Kuznets curve. What is the theory behind the Environmental Kuznets curve? As you see, on the horizontal axis, we are measuring GDP per capita or income per capita. And what are we measuring on the vertical axis? Now, we are measuring the level of environmental degradation. What does this curve show? As per capita income rises, that is, as a country, as an economy progresses, the level of environmental degradation increases. Why does this happen? Now, when an economy starts from an agrarian economy to, say, an industrialized economy, people are poor. So, their main priority is higher income, more jobs. At that time, firms do not have enough resources to spare on pollution abatement measures. Neither do the people care about these measures at that time. So during this phase, when an economy is in its initial industrial phase, the level of environmental degradation increases. This goes on till a peak is reached where the economy becomes more or less an industrialized nation. Once this level is reached and the economy then starts towards a service-based economy, people become more aware, income has been reached up to a certain level where that people actually start caring about the environment. So there is a demand for clean air, clean water, etc. environmental goods. So at this time, the level of environmental degradation also starts to drop. So thus ultimately what do we get? We get an inverted U-shaped curve. Now one thing we have to remember here is that while we are talking about this turning point, we have to remember that for the developing countries, this turning point actually takes a while to be achieved. Because for the developing countries, resources are scarce and it takes a while for them to reach this turning point where firms start caring, people start caring about the environment. So unless and until this threshold is reached, this threshold income is reached, the environment continues to be degraded. That is, the EKC, the Environmental Kuznets Curve for developing nations continue to be more stretched than that of the developed nations. That is, in other words, the turning point where the Environmental Kuznets Curve, where the environmental degradation starts to fall, comes at a much later stage than that of the developed nations. I hope this analysis is clear to all of you. So what we have learned? We have learned about the Environmental Kuznets Curve. The question that you might be asked is, why is the Environmental Kuznets Curve inverted U-shaped? I hope you will be able to answer this without any problem. move on to our third section, that is economic activity and climate change. As we have said, and you have probably learned and understood by now, that the activities of individuals, firms, economic agents, consumers have a deep impact on the environment. Now, this adverse impact of economic activities on the environment can be local, can be transboundary in nature, or can be global. What do we mean by local damage? What do we mean by local pollution? Now, when economic activities pollute and degrade the environment of a particular locality where such activities are undertaken and they remain confined there only, we can term it to be local pollution. Let us explain with a simple example. If your neighborhood has a small pond and the nearby consumers, the nearby people, they start throwing their waste in that particular pond, the fish in that pond will slowly die. This can be called to be a local pollution because it does not spread to other regions, to other countries, or it does not immediately have an impact on the global environment. What do we mean by transboundary pollution? When such economic activities cause pollution and the pollution is spread to not only one country, but it passes on to another country, then we can call that pollution to be transboundary in nature. For example, if a river originates in one particular country and moves on to another country, now the place where the river originates, the multinational corporations which are located in that particular area, they go on dumping all the waste in the river. Then the waste are ultimately carried forward by the river to that neighboring country where the river goes and meets the sea level. So that way the pollution is spread to the other country as well. The fish in that region may die, which may be a loss of financial crisis for the anglers of that particular country. This may cause their serious livelihood damage. So this type of effect, pollution effect, is transboundary in nature. And the third, we have the global pollution. When pollution is not restricted to any particular region, to particular country, but it spreads across globally, then what we have global pollution. Example of global pollution can be ozone depletion, global warming, deforestation, acid rain. All these are problems which are not related to any particular country or region but spread across the globe. Now the question is, how do we measure these effects of pollution and how do we actually find solution to curb these effects? The problem with environmental goods is that they are public goods in nature. They are not traded in the market, so they do not have appropriate pricing policy. Now, since they do not have appropriate pricing policy, resources tend to be aggravated, they tend to be overexploited. This results often in a shortage of resources as well. I am sure you have heard of common pool resources. You have heard about the problems or tragedy of common. These are all examples of resources where they are not marked by any particular property rights. So in our next section, we will learn about how to tackle these environmental problems. But before I enter that section, I repeat what we have learned in this section. We have learnt about, first, how environment gets damaged through free trade via the scale effect, the composition effect, and the technology effect. We have learnt about how pollution can be global, local, or transboundary. We have learnt about the Environmental Kuznets Curve. Now, all these things are arising, as I said, because environment is an externality and we do not have measures to price these goods. We do not have measures to set up the price for clean air or clean water, though we derive utility from them. So the next question is, how do we measure these environmental goods then? Environmental goods are normally measured from two aspects: willingness to pay and willingness to accept. The WTA and the WTP approach. What do we mean by willingness to pay? If we have two parties, A and B, and we know that the activity of A is causing a negative externality to activity of B, then it is possible that if the two parties agree, then A can compensate B for his loss of welfare. This is known as willingness to pay approach. And what is willingness to accept? In this case, B knows that the activities of A is causing a loss of welfare to him. However, he is willing to accept a compensation from A because of his loss of welfare. That is willingness to accept approach. So, in environmental studies, these two approaches are usually used to determine, to set up a price for these environmental goods, which are normally not traded in the market. We do have different kinds of methods, such as the contingent valuation method, the hedonic pricing method, and the travel cost method, where we determine the pricing of such environmental goods. You need not go into much details regarding these methods. However, I will be giving you a small idea regarding these methods so that it is easier for you to understand. In the contingent valuation method, the respondents are asked, they are actually given a questionnaire where they can bid how much they are willing to pay for a particular environmental good. And it is through their willingness we set up a price for an environmental asset. So there is no market demand and supply for such goods, but it is through the willingness of the respondents where they agreed to pay for a particular good, environmental good, we can come across, or we can more or less determine the price for an environmental asset. The hedonic pricing method is normally used for the housing market. Usually, when we buy an apartment, the pricing of the apartment is done in terms of physical attributes like the number of rooms, the neighborhood of the apartment, etc. The hedonic pricing method actually also adds the environmental attribute in this section. That is, whether the apartment has access to clean air or clean water. Again, it is through the willingness to pay for this attribute that a price is set up for the environmental good. And lastly, we have the travel cost method, where a travel to an environmental site is taken up as approximation for how much we value that particular environment. For example, a travel to a nature park may be taken as approximation for an individual's love for nature, and the expenditure on going to that travel, to that particular natural park, the expenditure on that will determine how much the price for such nature park will be. I repeat, we do not need to know wholly about these sections, but some idea will help you in understanding about how environmental assets are priced. Now, we finally move on to our policy recommendations. I have mainly focused on 3 types of policy recommendations. Number 1 is community involvement programs. Community involvement programs speaks of measures taken from the grassroots level. If development agencies can actually work with community network, then that way our both national objective will be consistent with the local objective. Costs can be much less and the policies will be more consistent. The next measure that we will speak of is property rights and resource ownership. Often it is seen that in developing countries, if the resources are not priced properly, where they are given more subsidies and all, it leads to greater amount of wastage. For example, groundwater in many developing countries are abundantly subsidized and leads to huge amount of water shortage in several areas. So if the resources are priced properly, then we might control the over-extraction of these resources. These are in brief some of the policy recommendations for control of environmental assets. I hope this lecture will help you to clear your impressions about the economy and the environment, how free trade leads to environmental damage. Thank you.